Technology is rewriting warfare.
The most crucial thing now is the technological progression.
What takes Western defense industries years, Ukraine now iterates in days.
This is how warfare in the future is going to be.
Welcome, everyone, to Unconventional Knowledge from Geopolitical Intelligence Services. I'm Andy Kureth, Managing Editor here at GIS, and today we have something very special for you. We talk a lot at GIS about geopolitics, strategy, and of course, scenarios, but today's guest is someone who has actually experienced conflict on the ground. In trenches, safe houses, drone factories, and forward positions across Ukraine. Our guest is Dr. Paul Schwennesen, a GIS expert who has made multiple trips to the Ukrainian front lines. He has worked directly with special operations units, drone teams, partisan networks, and even Chechen fighters battling alongside Ukrainian forces. His Eyewitness to War series for GIS has been one of the most vivid, unfiltered looks at how this conflict is really being fought and what the future of warfare may look like. Paul, it's a privilege to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Andy. Appreciate that very much. And of course, the minute you said that, my throat starts to tickle and I've got a cough, so bear with me. No, but I appreciate the chance to chat. And again, as we said, to get the message out about what's really happening in Ukraine. Everybody is loosely familiar with the broad outlines of the conflict. I'm a bottom-up kind of guy, and I really like the granular detail, and I think that's something that the GIS has done a really good job for helping decision makers around the globe to understand not just the broad outlines, but the intricate details of not only conflicts, but geopolitics in general. So again, thank you for the opportunity.
And thank you for that. And getting down into some of that granular detail is absolutely what we're about, so that decision makers can really make the right decisions. So I hope that we can really dig into some of those today, and I know that we will. And your reports, especially your Eyewitness to War series, provides something uniquely valuable to GIS readers, firsthand accounts of the Ukraine conflict. So today we're going to really lean heavily on your experiences seeing the evolution of modern war in real time. What you've seen, what it means, and what our audience should understand about the way this conflict is unfolding on the ground. So let's jump in. And let's start with the simplest, but I don't know, maybe the hardest question. And that's this. You've spent time with, as I said, special forces, regular brigades, drone operators, volunteers, even the civilian logistics networks that keep everything glued together. But can you describe the basic feel of the war? What stands out to you, and how is it the same or different from other conflicts you've experienced?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the feel of a war zone ultimately determines the trajectory of the war itself to some extent. And so one of the sort of counterintuitive things that I try to tell people about the war in Ukraine is that it's a strangely bifurcated war. I mean, it is a war that affects the entire country, absolutely. But 99% of the country is absolutely normal. I mean, barring the chance of missiles, people live the average day-to-day life. You see baby strollers, you see cafe life, you see restaurants, in all parts of the country, even right up against, the near front lines. For instance, in Sumy, you'll see people just strolling in the parks. And then it transitions from that perfectly normal to an absolute hellscape, this very thin razor edge of very, very raw, almost inhuman conflict at the very front edge of the zero line, they call it. So in other words, the feeling can vary dramatically in 1 kilometer. It can feel from absolutely normal to absolutely abnormal in a very short time. It has some psychological implications, I think, and we get into those later if you want to, because it has effects on morale, and the general country's disposition towards the war and how they interpret the war. But just again, I'm going to throw lots of examples out there just because I think they matter more than the abstractions. So an example is working with a special forces unit near Kursk, actually just at the time when the Kursk incursion had happened. We had a unit explaining to us that in the mornings they were drinking coffee and having, breakfast at a cafe, transition, about 4 kilometers into the front line and are just in the middle of a hellscape shooting at Russians, taking fire. And by that afternoon, they're again back out eating pizza in the park. And that's just wild. That's just wild to me. Compared to my experience in Afghanistan and other places, war zone is a war zone. It's always rather austere. That's not the case in Ukraine. It goes from austere to sort of normal Western European lifestyle, and then back to austere again.
That's very interesting. Do you have any idea as to why that might be?
That's a good question. I mean, part of it is just I think it's a reflection in a way of the efficient way that Ukraine has defended itself. It's like a wall. It's like a moral and physical wall that Russia has pushed up against. That accounts for this very thin line. Again, the country is indeed touched all over. I mean, I'm not trying to belittle the suffering that happened to the rest of the country, because again, missiles can hit any piece of Ukraine as far west as Poland. So, and again, people are moving into shelters and so forth. But I think that wall phenomenon is a reflection of how well Ukraine has established its defensive lines and how well they're holding back this tide of Russian aggression. In the trench lines, we were joking with some of the folks we're embedded with, that the trench line feels like a combination of World War I and Terminator 3. I mean, you're living in trenches. People are actually reviving World War I techniques on how to build wooden shelters and how to get water in and out of trenches and things like that. While at the same time operating thermal, IR drone technology in and out, fiber optic cables. I mean, it's just a very strange mix.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. And actually, we are going to get into all of that. We're going to dig into all the things that you said. But for my next question, I wanted to talk about another thing that makes this conflict unique from what you've written for us in your Eyewitness to War series. And that is one of the most striking things that you say is that Ukraine's war effort is not the stereotypical centralized top-down military machine. Typically, we think of wars as, generals at the top and then officers on the way down to your general infantrymen or whatever. But what you describe is something almost like a massive countrywide startup, improvised logistics hubs, volunteer networks, grandmothers delivering jars of pickles to soldiers, community mechanics welding together makeshift weapons mounts, right? So how does this decentralized ecosystem actually work, and how important is it to Ukraine's ability to keep fighting?
Yeah, no, it is a remarkable phenomenon. Everybody I've talked to who's been there notices the same thing, particularly former military folks like myself, who are used to a highly professional, very well-funded professional war machine like the U.S. military, are used to seeing very hierarchical, very centralized distribution plans and doctrinal applications and so forth. In Ukraine, it's a little bit like the Wild West, which is a double-edged sword. But I was rather impressed over and over again with the extent of the national mobilization. Napoleon, I think, called it lever en masse, when the entire country is on a war footing. And it really is true. And again, that's why it evokes some of this World War I, World War II ethos, because you literally have grandmothers weaving camouflage nets in, the middle of Lviv. You literally have volunteers, people's cousins bringing in drones or weapons on their personal vehicles out to the front lines. I mean, everybody's engaged, just because they can't help but be engaged. Again, since none of the country is immune to attack, everyone, remembers daily by the hour that they are in fact at war, and that they have very little choice but to be involved and to try to help stem this Russian invasion, which is incremental but very, very real. So again, since 80% of the modern kinetic activity happening at the front line is happening with drone technology, and we'll get into that more, since that's happening, drones is one of these unique weapon systems which does not require a equivalent of Raytheon or Rheinmetall or any of the other major, defense contractors that we are used to seeing. Drones can be built and tweaked in somebody's kitchen, and we saw this all the time. You see iterations happening at literally the sort of kitchen table level of development, and it's happening nationwide, and so it creates this kind of evolutionary weapon space, which I think Western leaders ought to take note of. I'm not saying it's the answer. And clearly there is a centralization, there is a Ministry of Defense, and the Ukrainians are quite good, I would say, at their professionalization of their armed forces. So I don't want to paint a picture of this as this is just a ragtag, spontaneous movement exclusively, but it is a combination of a bottom up and top down that seems to work pretty well.
That's really interesting. And to play off of what you just said about how everybody has to, and it's this fascinating dichotomy, right? Because people are living normal lives, as you said in the first part, but they also are intensely aware all the time that their country is at war, right? And they're involved in large ways and smalls. So, my next question revolves around that, and that is the morale. One of the most powerful and surprising threads in your report is how resilient that morale is among Ukrainians. And you've talked to people who've lost their homes, their relatives, even their limbs, and their attitude is essentially, we can outlast them, if not this year, then in 50 years, which is typically actually an attitude we associate with the Russian philosophy, right? But the Ukrainians have it here. So what's sustaining that level of resolve? Is it stable? And how does that morale translate into battlefield performance?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. It gets at the heart of, I think, what's going on in Ukraine. It's a complicated answer. So what is it? Samuel Johnson said that nothing concentrates the mind so wonderfully as the certain knowledge that you'll be hanged in a fortnight. And there's something in that, in the Ukrainian context, in that this is an existential threat. This is not an abstraction. This is not a sense, like we have in United States and Europe, that things are quote unquote going to hell and we should probably get our act together and be more politically active, whatever. This is a raw existential threat in which a country is genuinely trying to kill you, and will stop at nothing until they succeed. And so that might seem a bit flippant, but it really does generate that kind of focus and intensity that you see in Ukrainian society at large. This isn't to say they aren't tired, and this isn't to pretend that they're excited about the fact that they're being invaded. It's just that they have to do what they have to do, and so that morale comes with that sense of immediacy, that sense of obligation, that you see everywhere, up and down, from the front lines all the way to the rear echelons. You just see this sense of engagement and creativity. And so how that affects the battlefield was kind of the corollary to that question. And I think that's what's so heartening in some ways to see what's happening in Ukraine, is that frontline fighters, as exhausted as they might be, have no doubts as to where their country stands vis-a-vis supporting their efforts. I mean, they are literally bearing the burden and sacrificing their lives and living in hellish conditions in order to protect their country. But there's no doubt that the country is behind them. I mean, everybody, there's a moment of silence every single day. The national anthem plays in the train stations and people stop and they take a knee. It's kind of a remarkable mass phenomenon when everybody is focused in the same direction. And that focus is towards fighting off the Russians. So again, that has enormous implications for long-term morale. I wouldn't go as far as to say that their spirit can't be broken, but I would go as far as to say that their spirit is nowhere near being broken at this point, despite over 3 years of constant bombardment and the exhaustion that comes with it. There is no sense of giving up, and it's hard for me to even imagine a scenario in which they would. You think about World War II and Germany. I mean, the civilian population had been bombed to literal surrender and starvation levels. I think it would take something like that to begin to move the needle on the Ukrainian morale.
Okay, so they're determined, and as we said, they are decentralized. And there's this bifurcated atmosphere, right, going on. So those are all kind of, I don't want to say positive, but like, let's say, points in Ukraine's corner, right? But at the same time, you haven't shied away from talking about some of the problems, some of the possible frictions that are occurring in the war. Things like excessive bureaucracy, inter-unit finger pointing, bad risk assessment, poor coordination, even avoidable accidents, right? So what are the biggest internal weaknesses in your estimation, and the ones that genuinely concern you when you think about Ukraine's ability to sustain the fight?
Yeah, it's hard. Again, I can only see from my limited vantage point, and I don't claim any kind of omniscience about the general political landscape of Ukraine. But from what I can tell, again, at the trench level, is bureaucracy is a real problem, and it's a real problem everywhere. Ukraine is not unique in this. It's just that they're, I think, still working out the sort of final vestiges of a Soviet mentality. It's largely gone. I mean, it's been on its way out since the 90s. But it's still there, and you see this, particularly in the highest ranking officers who were, who grew up in the Soviet way of warfare, and so there's an internal friction within Ukrainian society about how to exorcise those lingering demons of this, heavy, sort of slow, human meat wave, kind of tactics. And again, it's largely gone, but you still see elements of it. And even if you don't see it in reality, there's a perception within Ukrainian society that it's still there. And so it ends up playing into the politics in some very funny ways. There's often finger pointing from the bottom to the top, criticizing commanders' decisions, and basically it's kind of a perpetual trump card to say, well, he's just sacrificing our young men's lives. The implication is that he's behaving the way a Soviet general would, right? And so the danger of that is that it may not always be true, right? So you see this happening, and it sort of causes unnecessary friction in my mind. There may be commanders being relieved or losing status or losing battlefield effectiveness because they've been painted in the Soviet brush, rightly or wrongly, right? So that's one thing I sort of see. And it's related a little bit to what the rest of the world knows about Ukraine and quote unquote corruption. From what I've seen, I don't think Ukraine is necessarily any more corrupt than anywhere else. But again, it's one of those Soviet vestiges which becomes part of the stereotype. and gets deployed in some very complicated ways. Right? Sometimes it's true, and sometimes it's not true, and very few people know the real truth. And so it becomes this vicious political football, which can really just distract from frontline operations. It can really distract from the political will to get Western support. I mean, I can talk to people here in Texas who will say, well, yeah, sure, we support Ukraine, but what about their corruption? So clearly that is a theme that Russian disinformation campaigns can exploit to the hilt, and it has lasting implications. So I'd say that's a significant weakness.
That's really, really interesting, and thank you for the nuance that you're adding to that. To move on, because you mentioned drones earlier, and that is a crucial element to this war, and something that has gotten a lot of global attention, frankly. So we ought to dive into it. You've witnessed what you call this usage of drones now in the Ukrainian space a fundamental revolution in warfare. And you said even just now around 70 to 80% of kinetic operations are performed by unmanned systems. And you report how Ukraine has built a nationwide ecosystem of drone labs and factories and 3D printing workshops and AI-driven munitions. So how have drones changed the battlefield, and why do you think this is the new normal for global conflict?
Yeah. I will preface it by saying that I was a little bit slow to adopt the revolution moniker for drones. I'm a historian by training. To take the broad view, I tend to be sort of slow to profess belief in radical changes. But this is one of those. This is one of those radical changes, and there's no denying that from my experience. And I do want to. I sort of want caveat. Everybody focuses on the drones, and clearly drones are the technology that get the headlines, but it's not really about the drones. It's the pinpoint delivery of explosives that is the real thing here. I mean, artillery was the revolution in World War I for kind of the same reasons. It was a way to deliver explosives and shrapnel into enemy bodies at distance and at scale and with accuracy, relative accuracy. What's happening with drones today is the same thing, just even more so, even more accurate, even more widely scaled, and so forth. So in other words, I don't want to focus on the drones. I want to focus on the 500 grams of high explosive that you're able to deliver into the hatch of a Russian BMP, right? That's the revolution. It's the accuracy and the delivery of explosives that's the revolution. The drones simply happen to be the medium for that, right?
Can I just interrupt you there,
yeah.
just for our audience who may not know, just if you could just explain a BMP real quick.
Oh, sorry. That's a Russian armored personnel carrier, right? They're sort of the workhorse of the Russian military. And it's not just BMPs, of course. It's any vehicle or any infantry formation. I mean, anywhere you care to put a big boom or a small boom, you can now do with relatively little training and relatively little expense. That's what the drones have brought to the fight. And that's why the world's, what's the joke go, that the world's second largest army was, Russia went from the world's second largest army in the world to the second largest army, or the second most effective army in Ukraine, right? That's what changed the equation, is Ukraine's ability to adopt widely available technology, relatively cheap technology, and to be able to put explosive units, starting with simple grenades being dropped by commercial drones, now into these highly sophisticated drones that can deliver explosives anywhere they want to, including with the Flamingo missiles and on beyond, including to the farthest reaches of Siberia. It's an extraordinary development. And has really put the Russian machine onto its back, onto its heels. But I think the rest of the West is also looking at this, saying, how can we interpret this revolution?
Yeah, fascinating. Um, that's really interesting because I would have expected you to talk about the unmanned nature of the drones, but the thing that you emphasized was this pinpoint accuracy, which is also obviously very, very important. And the next question that I want to jump on is actually somewhat related to that because there's an innovativeness going on here with how all of these tools are being used, right? And you've seen Ukrainians melting down old Soviet mines in rice cookers. You've seen them repurposing warheads and mounting them on $300 drones. You've been in small sheds that function as high-tech weapons labs. So I'm wondering if you could give our audience a taste or a few examples of the most creative or most effective innovations that you've witnessed up close in Ukraine.
Yeah, sure. It's always just amazing to me. Every time I go to Ukraine, I come back just sort of shaking my head, and it takes some time for it to sort of sink in. Just at the level of I mean, off the charts kind of development and creativity. And again, examples. I'm reminded of a moment where I was with an elite drone team, and they were explaining how they were 3D printing cases for their explosive charges, complete with a copper cone shaped charge, um, so that they could make a custom tailored explosive package for individualized targets. So again, coming from the U.S. military, you're used to getting, a weapons system or a set of ammunition, but you're not used to building your own stuff. I mean, that you can maybe tweak things in the battlefield a little bit here and there, but the Ukrainians are building their own stuff. I mean, they're literally building their own individualized weapons packages. So, for instance, the Third Assault Battalion we were with was building these 3D printed right there a kilometer away from the front line. They were 3D printing their own cartridges or their own casings for explosives with a copper cone shaped charge in order to specifically attack an armored target. In this case, they weren't going for tanks because the tanks have receded from the front lines in obvious ways. So they wanted to hit some of the more lightly armored targets with a relatively small, less than a kilo package of explosive with this shaped charge. And they're doing this all basically at home. They're doing this themselves, printing the cartridge or printing the casing, filling it with their own explosives, and delivering it on their own FPVs. That's just to me. That's just it's hard to overstate how radical that is from a military perspective. It sounds easy, and in some ways it's surprisingly easy, but the effects it has on the battlefield are immense because it's about efficiency. They're not using a 10-pound sledge to hit a 5-penny nail. They're individualizing their targets and their target packages in some radical ways that lead to enormous efficiencies. And when you're fighting an opponent 10 times larger than yourself with 10 times the manpower and equipment, you've got to be more efficient. You've got to be 10 times more efficient. And I think they, by and large, do just that.
And just to clarify, FPV, that means first person vehicle?
Yep. Sorry,
Yeah.
that's the standard.
Oh,
That's
sure.
the standard drone that most people are used to seeing on the
Right.
battlefield.
Right. So anyway, so exactly what you said goes back to this decentralization point again, which I find very interesting. And as long as we're still talking about technology, I want to bring up this very interesting development. Well, I want to talk about electronic warfare generally, but I'm especially interested in the fiber optic spool drones. And if you could talk a little bit about that, but also maybe some of the frequency hopping and intercepting each other's drone video feeds. What does that chess match look like? And how quickly are these tactics evolving?
Well, again, I feel like some of my answers are the same, but it is absolutely just a wild, wild scenario. The iteration and the development is just off the charts. In terms of the spool drones are themselves a outcome of the intense electronic warfare they call EW, the electronic warfare spectrum battle that's happening at that, again, at that zero line. The Russians had traditionally, ever since the Cold War, been quite good at swamping frequencies with high-powered transmitters. And so it became evident fairly early on that they had the edge in terms of jamming the frequencies needed to transmit the locating and navigation signals used overwhelmingly for these first-person view drones, right? The drones. But the Ukrainians were pretty good at doing it themselves in reverse. And so it became this, kind of an arms race in the EW spectrum, in which both sides are doing their best to jam everything, jam all frequencies all the time, which is impossible to do. And it became evident to me how clever the Ukrainians were. I've used this metaphor. The Ukrainians almost have a mental map, at least frontline units have a mental map of the electronic warfare weather on any given day in any given moment. Because no country, even one as big as Russia, can jam all of these frequencies all the time. They have to have transmitters everywhere, and the front line is just too big and too vast to do this effectively. So there's holes. There's always little holes. And over time, these Ukrainian units got better and better about exploiting those gaps and those holes and developing kind of a three-dimensional model of the electronic weather at any time, at any one moment, and how best to exploit those gaps in the weather. So then, as a result of that jamming environment, the spool drones developed. And so they're a fiber optically tethered, cable tethered drone. Russians were the sort of the first out of the box on this, although it was kind of neck and neck and still is. Basically, the Russians developed this spool drone technology to allow them to operate within a fully frequency jammed environment. So basically, frequency jamming is irrelevant if you're cable tied directly to the operator, right? They're sending a fiber optic signal directly to their drone. So obviously the Ukrainians adopted this too. And so it becomes this sort of perpetual arms race on who's going to, operate more effectively. The cable drones started at something like a 2 to 3 kilometer range. And as of now, they're already pushing 30 kilometers. We're seeing video footage of Russians sending drones into Kramatorsk 30 kilometers away from their position with a 30-kilometer long fiber optic cord, which means, again, tangible granular details. The front line is just draped everywhere you go. Everything is draped in what looks kind of like thick spiderweb or fishing line. I mean, it's everywhere. It's draped in the trees. It's draped in the trenches. It's everywhere you go. So yeah, it's a wild, developing, kind of constantly fluxing environment. Interesting.
Yeah. For any members of our audience who haven't actually seen it, you can see pictures of these of the lines of the battle zone, just as you said, draped in this spider web of fiber optic cables that were once attached to drones and operators. Right? It's really fascinating, really really weird.
Yep.
But
Weird.
yeah, maybe I kind of want to talk about the Russian side a little bit here, because you've described them in your reports as well. And what you say is that the frontline Russian troops are living in conditions that are almost inconceivably bad, to the point that captured soldiers smelled like corpses because they'd been living among human remains in underground tunnels. You've also mentioned heavy drinking, lax discipline, bizarrely casual behavior under surveillance, and at the same time, some real tenacity in certain circumstances. So, what have you actually seen of the Russian forces up close? And what should people understand about the Russian side of this war that doesn't really make it into the headlines?
Yeah, it's something that I puzzle over quite a bit. Again, I'm not within the Russian, you know, milieu in any way. All I can do is sort of see it reflected a bit. And what I'm left with over and over again is just this head scratching recognition that this just can't go on. You talked earlier about the morale of the Ukrainians and the fact they have their entire country behind them and they have an existential threat. None of those factors are in the Russians' favor. A granular example is when I was there last January, I think it was February. Really cold, steppe weather, snow everywhere. And in a frontline sector, every square meter is under surveillance, often in multiple spectra, including thermal. And so the Ukrainian team we were with is sitting within a repurposed house with heat and running water. They're drinking tea while they're monitoring their sector with drones, while the poor bastard on the Russian side is living in a hole in the frozen cold. He can't put his head out, and when he did, he gets a grenade dropped on it. The differential in just raw living conditions is extraordinary. Um, that isn't all the time in every place, but it is a generality that holds. Is that the Russian front line is a much worse place to be than if you're on the Ukrainian side, which is a traditional that's a war truism. That's one advantage defenders generally have, is that they have internal supply lines. They're going to be quote unquote more comfortable or more able to just withstand the raw elements than the attacking force. So all that said, this goes back to my head scratching piece, is how can Russia keep doing this? They're losing 1,000 people a day, sometimes as many as 1,500 a day. How can a system absorb that much hemorrhaging? And Russia historically is famous for this. It is famous for absorbing losses that just boggle the Western mind. So I think in my mind it comes down to a race. Which is going to collapse first? The Russian war machine, which can rely on mass, just raw, brute mass, or this sort of scrappier, more innovative Western system, which doesn't seem to have the same level of pain tolerance. And so it's a little bit like watching a boxing match between a heavyweight champ and a lightweight in some ways. The heavyweight can just absorb so much, so many more hits. But if the lightweight is fast and smart, they stand a chance. So it's anyone's guess how this will all come out.
Fascinating. So let's talk about how this looks moving forward. Based on everything you've observed firsthand, what do you think the battlefield looks like over the next 12 months? Not politically, but operationally. Are we in for more incremental gains, a collapse somewhere, a grinding stalemate? What do you think?
Well, it's easy to guess. My educated guess is that we will likely see over the next winter and spring season more of these incremental gains by the Russian side. These sort of chewing away at the Pokrovsks and the Khersons. That's almost inevitable. And frankly, I think that's actually to the strategic advantage of the Ukrainian defenders. I think they're doing it on purpose. They could probably put up a stiffer defense and quote unquote hold more territory if they wished to. But as I wrote about recently, losing slowly can be a winning strategy, and it's one that Russians have used over and over again against invasions from the Nazis or the French, or you pick your conflict. If you can draw an enemy in deeper and deeper and deeper, they just get weaker and weaker and weaker. And I think the Ukrainians are doing that, maybe not in a fully formalized way, but it effectively works out the same way, where these incremental gains that Russian has, coming at such enormous costs, may be the only real winning strategy against a numerically, physically superior foe, which is to let your enemy destroy themselves, right? And I do think that's well within the realm of possibility. I'd be willing to wager a bottle of fine alcohol on the fact that Russia, the Russian Federation, as authoritarian and brittle as it is, collapses long before the Ukrainians do. And I go so far as to say, I think it may happen this year, this coming year in 2026, may be the last year we know the the Russian Federation as we know it may exist, because the pressure is just inconceivably high on them. We will see. Time will tell. But operationally, I would suspect that when that rupture comes, and I do think it's a question of when, not if, when that rupture comes, the Russian invaders will disappear the way they came in. It will be like a in the night.
Okay. Well, I think a fast end to the conflict is something everybody is hoping for. So just my last question here is essentially, what should Western militaries learn? I think this is probably the most important question for our audience. And Ukraine is teaching the world how 21st century war works. It's cheap, it's iterative, it's decentralized, it's fast, and it's tech driven. So if you were briefing Western military leaders, what would you tell them they need to learn from what you've seen?
Yeah, I think I would just emphasize everything you just said. They need to somehow, and this is a big ask, particularly in entrenched military culture, but they need to institutionalize decentralization. Americans, at least the U.S. side, have been good about centralized command and decentralized execution. This is something I was taught as a young officer, and I think it's something that the West and NATO has done pretty well. It hasn't really bled into the way that they procure weapon systems and the way they innovate. And I think that would be the biggest takeaway, is they need to take that same doctrinal emphasis on decentralized execution and try to apply that into procurement. Decentralized procurement can also be a major a major force multiplier by basically you're trying to harness the latent creative energies of millions of people instead of 2 to 3 prime contractors, right? It's easier said than done. I'm not trying to pretend that's just an easy button. But it has enormous implications if you can do it right, and particularly if you can bolt it onto an existing procurement system. I'm not a radical by by default, but I do think you can add some radical elements into your weapons procurement and your weapons innovation chain. And so I would say that would be one thing that Western leaders really ought to try to adopt is look at Silicon Valley. Look at tech startup cultures. Look how they communicate. Send your officers into those small startups. Bring those small startups into the DoD. And they are doing this to some extent at the Pentagon. They tend to be more token efforts than institutionalized ones. The institutional momentum is vast in NATO, in the NATO culture and in the Pentagon culture. But we have to adapt. We have to adopt that adaptation mentality that Ukraine is pioneering in order to stay ahead of the game. I think at this point, most people I've talked to in the U.S. military, the kinds of questions they ask about what's happening in Ukraine tells me that they are probably a decade or at this point even a generation behind what's happening on the front lines in Ukraine. They're so far behind they don't even know how behind they are. Because what's happening in Ukraine happens, the iteration cycle is measured in days, whereas the iteration cycle is measured in the more institutionalized West in decades. So we've got to bridge that gap, and I think we need to start by decentralizing our procurement process and trying to, again, embrace and harness that creative energy that exists in a free society.
Fascinating. Really, really interesting stuff. Paul, this has been absolutely fascinating. Your perspective is really rare, and it genuinely helps people to understand a war that's often abstracted or sanitized in the media. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experiences with us today. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you. It's been a privilege. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about it, and keep up the good fight.
Thanks, Paul. And to everyone listening, if you want to read the full Eyewitness to War series, and I recommend you do, you can find all of Paul's reports at gisreportsonline.com. We'll keep following developments in Ukraine closely, and we hope today's episode gave you a deeper, more grounded understanding of what this conflict really looks like on the front lines. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Unconventional Knowledge. Take care, everybody.
That's it for this episode of Unconventional Knowledge, a podcast from Geopolitical Intelligence Services. Thank you for listening. New episodes are released on the first Monday of every month, so subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to stay updated. For more analysis on global affairs with a detailed focus on future scenarios, visit gisreportsonline.com. And if you'd like to explore how any of the trends discussed today could affect your business or industry, email us at advisory@gis.li for a consultation or a custom report. We'll see you next month.